We're going to finish today with a lecture from Judge Thomas Griffith. Judge Griffith was appointed by President George W. Bush to the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit in 2005. At the time of his appointment, Judge Griffith was the general counsel of Brigham Young University, where he led a coalition of religious colleges and universities working to preserve their unique role in American higher education. Earlier in his career, Judge Griffith was a partner at a law firm in Washington, D.C., and for several years served as Senate legal counsel, the chief legal officer of the U.S. Senate. In that capacity, he advised the Senate leadership and its committees on various matters, including, notably, the impeachment trial of President Bill Clinton. Long active in the rule of law initiatives in the former communist states of Eastern Europe and Eurasia, Judge Griffith has taught law courses at the law schools of Brigham Young University and Stanford. He earned his undergraduate degree at BYU and his JD from the University of Virginia Law School. And I have to say, on a personal note, my association with Tom, getting to know him over the past few years, has been really one of the precious things that's come with this position. So I'm very grateful to Tom, not only as a legal scholar and a judge, but as a friend for accepting this invitation. So please join me in welcoming him.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick. And this has been a wonderful experience for me. I tell people who aren't too familiar with the work of an appellate judge that 99% of what I do is either reading or writing by myself. And so we don't get out much. And so it's nice to get the invitation to get out and see so many old friends and make new friends. And I've benefited greatly from the discussions and the fellowship. So I want to thank the organizers of the event. And I also realize that I'm the last stop keeping you from going home for your vacations and keeping you from your family. So I'll try and be brief. But two things to sort of get started. Many years ago, I used to work for Mo Udall, who was a Democratic congressman from Arizona, and he was, for a period of time, the chairman of the House Interior Committee, a pretty important committee of Congress, and Mo had a saying that he would use at most committee hearings, as he would be the last one to speak. He would say, "You know, as I listen to it, everything has been said, but not everyone has said it." So you will hear in my remarks, I think, some themes that have been developed over the course of the last 2 days. And Katrina, are you still here? Okay. So I have to mention something. Katrina's a dear friend, and as you learned today, a champion for religious liberty. When we were listening to Sister Oaks speak earlier this morning, and she began her presentation with reference to Thomas More, I noticed Katrina pulled out of her purse, as she showed you, her dog-eared copy of the Robert Bolt play, A Man for All Seasons. I tried to one-up her. I reached into my briefcase and pulled up the screenplay from the movie. So now I have to say this about More. Okay, the Thomas More I learned about was the rather idealized version portrayed by Robert Bolt in the play and in the movie. It turns out More, like all of us, is a little bit more complex person, and it appears that he was complicit in the persecution and burning of heretics. And my only response to that is, because I'm still a fan of Thomas More, is that somebody had to do that. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. I know we're on tape. No, I am unalterably opposed to the persecution of heretics for two reasons. It's wrong, and second, if our country ever resorts to that, they're coming after my people, right? So I don't want to be on the receiving end of that. Now to my prepared remarks. A sitting federal judge participates in a conference such as this, fettered with many restrictions on what he or she may say. So many, in fact, that it's a wonder that we are ever invited to comment on matters of public concern, beyond speaking about important yet mundane topics such as the rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, or the importance of the United States Constitution. Reach into pocket, obligatory showing of pocket copy of the Constitution, okay? Now, legislation that mandates the observance of Constitution Day by universities receiving federal funds has meant we judges get lots of requests to speak about the Constitution each September. But not too many other than that. Now, chief among the restrictions that limit what a federal judge can say in public is the bar on commenting on issues that may come before us. Due process requires not only that we limit our view of the merits of a matter to the arguments made before us by the litigants on the record they have created, but also that those litigants have reason to trust our impartiality in their case. For that reason, offering critiques of Supreme Court precedent by which I am bound is something I'm not allowed. Because of such restrictions, I must confess that the title of my remarks, Religious Liberty After Obergefell, may be misleading to some. In fact, a test run of this talk at the Yale Law School last month drew a large and spirited crowd that was, if truth be told, a bit disappointed in what I had to say. It turns out that seeing the title of my remarks in posters advertising my appearance and knowing something about my background, many of the students at Yale thought I would be taking to task the Supreme Court for its decision in Obergefell. But that's not my purpose. I'll leave that to Mike Ullman. No, that's not my purpose. My remarks today will be a tip of the hat to legal realists who argue that not only do a judge's life experiences inform his or her role as a judge, but that they should. But the tip of my hat today is ever so slight, because it has long been my view, and remains so today, that a judge should do all she can to prevent her life experience from affecting her approach to a case and its outcome. Permit me some biography here. During my confirmation proceedings, I found myself in the office of the aide to Democratic leader Senator Tom Daschle, who had been described to me, the aide had been described to me, as the architect of the filibuster against President George W. Bush's judicial nominees. I was more than a little anxious with this interview, fearing that a misstep here could seriously damage my chances of confirmation. Which American judge has had the greatest impact on your view of the role of an Article III judge? He fairly asked. John Marshall, was my response, straight from the Catechism for Judicial Nominees. My interlocutor had heard that before and was not impressed. He quickly asked me the follow-up I knew was coming. Other than John Marshall. The problem with his question, I thought, was the answer I was prepared to give. Robert Bork, I offered, sure that my response was a profile in courage. Sensing my anxiety about what effect that answer might have on him, Senator Daschle's aide said, "That's not a problem. We expect President Bush to nominate judicial conservatives." And the questioning moved on. I mention this story because Robert Bork was an outspoken critic of legal realism. He was old school on this, subscribing to the views of Herbert Wexler that the deepest problems of our constitutionalism are laid bare when courts function as a naked power organ. This problem occurs when a judge who is supposed to apply the law lets his judgment turn on the immediate result, that is, whether the outcome advances a cause he personally favors as a citizen. To avoid this problem, Wexler and Bork insist that judges must resolve the cases before them according to neutral principles, by standards that transcend the case at hand. In fact, the standard speech I gave to law students during my first few years on the bench was titled, "Was Bork Right About Judges?" The answer, in my view, was yes. And in my views in this regard have not changed. I'm still with Judge Bork. And yet, in my remarks today, I will call upon two facets of my life experience to address the topic, religious liberty, after Obergefell. The first is my religious faith. The second is my experience in Washington, D.C., working across political divides. I will resort to personal biography here to establish my interest in religious liberty and to offer a partial explanation for why I have the views I do about what should happen in the wake of Obergefell in the ongoing discussion about the role of religious liberty in the United States. In this regard, to some extent, I'm trying to invoke the spirit of what Justice Sotomayor said in her confirmation hearings about how one's life experiences can help judges to more easily see different perspectives in the cases before them. She said that these experiences help you to understand and listen. I'm also cloaking myself in the comments that presidential candidate Barack Obama made about the type of person he would appoint as a federal judge. He said that he hoped to find people who have life experience and understand what it means to be on the outside, what it means to have the system not work for them, because he believed that empathy would help them to be better judges. And I hope what I'm doing today is nothing more than what Justice Thomas did in the oral argument of the cross-burning case, where he drew upon his experience growing up black in the South in the days when cross-burnings were common. During oral argument, Justice Thomas accused the government of underestimating the effects of the burning cross, reminding counsel that the statute in question had been passed after almost 100 years of lynching and activity that constituted a reign of terror in the South that he believed was greater than simply intimidation or a threat. In this sense, I believe my life experience can also give me empathy to better understand where the parties in a case are coming from, to understand why the case matters to them, and to understand the context in which I am applying the law to the facts. As some of you may know, I am a believing and practicing Latter-day Saint. I served a full-time mission for the church in my youth. My first career, before I turned to the dark side to study law, was as a teacher of religion to high school and college-age students in the church's educational system. I've served as a bishop of an LDS ward and a president of an LDS stake. Currently, I teach the Hebrew Bible to high school juniors in a class that meets at church each weekday morning before school, and I teach the New Testament to young single adults in a class that meets at church every Tuesday evening. Now, for what it's worth, I'm not alone among Article III judges in the commitment to my faith. While paying my respects to Justice Scalia at the Supreme Court several weeks ago with my colleagues on the D.C. Circuit, I noticed that the portrait of Justice Scalia that overlooked his coffin included the artist's rendition of the Holbein portrait of St. Thomas More lying under Justice Scalia's arm. For 5 years, I was the general counsel of Brigham Young University, and the lion's share of my time at BYU was spent working on religious liberty issues in the accreditation process. As this group well knows, the church to which I belong has had a complicated relationship with state and federal government in the United States. My church was the target of an extermination order issued by the governor of Missouri in the 1830s. My peoples were refugees from the United States and claimed the Great Basin, of all places, as a home to practice their controversial beliefs. That practice tested the boundaries of the Free Exercise Clause, which proved to be less elastic than they had hoped. And of course, my church is at the center of today's controversy over the tension between religious liberty and our national commitment to avoid discrimination. I will let you judge whether my religious beliefs and commitments give me insight or are the evidence of bias. In addition to my religious beliefs, my experience reaching across political divides has been a central influence in my career. Although as an Article III judge, I no longer have any political views or allegiances. Why did you laugh at that? It's true. For much of my adult life, I was a conservative Republican. But I was not always a conservative Republican. In my youth, I was an anti-Vietnam War activist. I was always worried in the confirmation process what they'd find in my FBI background file, but they didn't show me, and I made it. I was an anti-Vietnam War activist, even at BYU. And my first vote was cast in 1972 for George McGovern. I used to work on Capitol Hill for Mo Udall, as I mentioned, the liberal Democratic congressman from Arizona, who, but for a few percentage points in 2 primaries, would likely have been beaten Jimmy Carter for the presidential nomination of the Democratic Party in 1976. Needless to say, over time, my views changed. But because of my past, I resonate with the story told of Ronald Reagan's rebuke to a young White House staffer. I wonder if this rebuke was to you, Mike. Tell me. You might have been there. It's a famous story where President Reagan rebuked a young White House staffer who had just launched a tirade against Democrats who were being unfairly critical of the president. Remember, President Reagan said, they are our opponents, not our enemies. That approach served me well when Senator Dole asked me to be Senate Legal Counsel, the chief legal officer of the United States Senate. Senator Dole and his leadership staff made clear to me that they expected me to abide my statutory duty to act in my office without regard to partisan affiliation. I did so, and because of that, won the confidence and even the friendship of Democratic and Republican senators. Truth be told, it was those relationships that led to my appointment to the D.C. Circuit. I am told that President Bush chose me because he thought I could be confirmed during a time when some of his nominations to the federal judiciary were being filibustered. Reaching out across partisan divides is the horse I rode onto the D.C. Circuit, and I'm still in that saddle. Which means that I wrote the opinion for a panel of the D.C. Circuit that rejected the Obama administration's argument that subsidies were available for insurance purchased on federal exchanges, a view that was rejected 6-3 by the Supreme Court in King v. Burswell. But it also means that I cast the deciding vote on the panel of the D.C. Circuit that sided with the Obama administration and upheld the constitutionality of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, among the most beneficial pieces of legislation in the nation's history. That view was rejected 5-4 by the Supreme Court in Shelby County. Now, enough about me. Finally, I get to the topic. There was a purpose for this besides ego and narcissism, although I'm certain that was an element of it as well. But here's the point. As a person interested in religious liberty, I think there is some very good news for believers. I find in the majority opinions in Hosanna Tabor and Hobby Lobby a robust respect for religious conscience, even when it conflicts with secular laws. In Hobby Lobby, the Supreme Court held that the federal government cannot require closely held corporations to provide employees with insurance for emergency contraception when doing so violates their sincerely held religious beliefs. In recognizing that corporations have religious exercise rights, the court took a broad view of how far those rights extend. And the court made clear that it will protect religious rights when the government can achieve its policy priorities in ways that are less damaging to religious freedom. In Hosanna Tabor, the court presented a united front in favor of religious liberty. The EEOC had brought an action against a Lutheran school that allegedly fired a teacher in retaliation for threatening to sue under the Americans with Disabilities Act. The Solicitor General had argued that the religion clauses of the First Amendment do not protect a church's decision about who to hire in such capacities. But the Supreme Court unanimously rejected that extreme position, holding that these teachers are ministers, and the First Amendment bars suits brought on behalf of ministers against their churches for violation of employment discrimination laws. In Hosanna Tabor, the court embraced a position of independence for churches and protected them from governmental interference with their internal governance. Jim Sani, who directs the Religious Liberty Clinic at Stanford Law School, has pointed out that cases like Hosanna Tabor are the norm. He writes, with the exception of Hobby Lobby, the Supreme Court has acted with virtual unanimity in every free exercise dispute it has heard this millennium. And Obergefell itself provides some good news for religious liberty. In his majority opinion, Justice Kennedy rejected the idea that support for traditional marriage was rooted in animus. I quote from Justice Kennedy, "It must be emphasized that religions and those who adhere to religious doctrines may continue to advocate with utmost sincere conviction that by divine precepts, same-sex marriage should not be condoned. The First Amendment ensures," he writes, "that religious organizations and persons are given proper protection as they seek to teach the principles that are so fulfilling and so central to their lives and faiths, and to their own deep aspirations to continue the family structure that they have long revered. The same is true of those who oppose same-sex marriage for other reasons." End of quote. Of course, I recognize that some see in Obergefell a portent of a future in which religious liberty is forced to yield to the views of the political majority. In their dissents, Chief Justice Roberts and Justices Thomas and Alito suggested as much, at least hinted as much. The Chief Justice believed that the majority opinion creates serious questions about religious liberty. Justice Thomas warned of tension as individuals and churches are confronted with demands to participate in and endorse civil marriages between same-sex couples, creating potentially ruinous consequences for religious liberty. And Justice Alito worried that those who vocally oppose same-sex marriage now risk being labeled as bigots and treated as such by governments, employers, and schools. Furthermore, as we heard earlier today, the colloquy and oral argument between the Solicitor General and Justice Alito has created no small amount of anxiety among religiously affiliated entities, particularly colleges and universities. As the Chief Justice summarized in his dissent, the Solicitor General candidly acknowledged that the tax exemption of some religious institutions would be in question if they opposed same-sex marriage. A distinguished professor at Notre Dame reacted to the decision in Obergefell by predicting that, quote, "We should expect the decision to inaugurate the greatest crisis of religious liberty in American history," end of quote. Others see in the decision yet another marker of increasing secularization, more evidence that we are far removed from the worldview of the framers of the First Amendment that gave religion special protection from state interference. Down the road, there are a number of religious liberty issues that will play out in the courts. Of course, I have no opinion on how these cases should or will come out, but these are the types of religious liberty cases that lie just over the horizon now. The first type of case deals with religious exemptions of the sort confronted in Hobby Lobby. Historically, these cases were brought under the Free Exercise Clause, with religious believers arguing that they need not follow certain secular laws when doing so would violate their sincerely held religious beliefs. Because the court eliminated the Free Exercise Clause as the source of religious exemptions in its 1990 decision, Employment Division versus Smith, authored by the late Justice Scalia. Today, those cases are brought instead under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. Congress's swift and forceful reaction to Smith, passed unanimously in the House and by a margin of 97-3 in the Senate, and signed by President Clinton in a Rose Garden ceremony, RFRA restored religious exemptions. Although the Supreme Court ultimately held that RFRA applies only to the federal government, 21 states have passed their own versions of RFRA. Hobby Lobby, for example, was brought under RFRA, not under the Free Exercise Clause. A number of RFRA cases are percolating in the lower courts that pit religious conscience interests against anti-discrimination principles. For example, plaintiffs have brought suits against a number of small business owners who have denied them service, arguably in violation of state anti-discrimination laws, when providing that service would violate their religious beliefs. We've heard numerous stories today about cake bakers and wedding photographers who have refused to provide their services for same-sex weddings. But states in Colorado, Oregon, and New Mexico have held against them under state anti-discrimination laws. Perhaps the most worrisome issue for religious entities is the one highlighted in Justice Alito's colloquy with the Solicitor General during oral argument in Obergefell, the tax-exempt status for religious colleges and universities that refuse to provide married student housing to same-sex couples. The court confronted a similar issue in 1983 in a case called Bob Jones University versus Simon, which we've already heard about today. There, the government revoked a religious university's tax-exempt status because it prohibited interracial marriage. The university argued that it had a religious belief that God intended racial segregation, but the court held that the government had a fundamental and overriding interest in ending racial discrimination in education, one that it likened to eradicating child labor. If the government moves to revoke the tax-exempt status of educational institutions opposed to same-sex marriage, the government will likely argue that same-sex marriage presents the same type of fundamental interest as in Bob Jones. Religious colleges and universities will likely respond that racial discrimination is not like same-sex marriage, and that the purpose of tax exemptions is to promote diversity, not uniformity. For example, they will likely point to Justice Powell's concurrence in Bob Jones, in which he emphasized that the government's policy against racial discrimination in education is especially fundamental, and that a purpose of tax exemptions is to encourage diverse, conflicting views and limit the influence of governmental orthodoxy on important areas of community life. Beyond free exercise questions that involve religious exemptions, other groups are using the Free Exercise Clause to challenge the government's unequal treatment of religious groups. These challenges seek equal treatment rather than separate treatment of religious people. One issue concerns the government's refusal to accommodate religious objectors when it accommodates other non-religious groups. There is a cert petition now pending before the Supreme Court on a case involving Washington state pharmacists who object to selling the morning after pill on religious grounds. The petitioners argue that Washington allows pharmacists not to sell the morning after pill for a host of secular reasons, such as demand for the drug, cost, and shelf space, in which case the pharmacy will refer the customer to another pharmacy that sells the drug. But that Washington makes it illegal to make such a referral only when the pharmacy's reason is its conscience. Yet others, including the ACLU, argue that allowing such refusals based on conscience would harm women by reducing their access to constitutionally protected health care. Professor Michael McConnell of Stanford Law School has suggested that the evidence in litigation showed that conscience exemptions did not meaningfully affect patient access to the drugs. And so a question for the court is whether a conscience exemption impermissibly harms third parties when it makes it more difficult, but not that difficult, to get a drug. Although it is impossible to predict how these cases will come out, the history of the Free Exercise Clause sheds some light on how these types of problems would have been viewed historically and provides a basis for both sides, whether one is primarily concerned with protecting religious liberty or with promoting anti-discrimination principles or access to women's health care, to look toward compromise instead of embracing a winner-take-all approach. Providing support for the religious liberty side of that compromise, Professor McConnell has argued that the Free Exercise Clause grew out of evangelical religious movements that espoused the primacy of religious conscience over secular laws and viewed the constitutional guarantee of free exercise as protecting the right actively to fulfill religious duties without state interference. To the religious enthusiasts, the church-state problem was principally a religious problem. The state too frequently used its power to prevent the practice and spread of the gospel. The Baptists languishing in the Culpeper jail and the Presbyterians fighting legislative interference with their form of church governance were fearful of government, not religion. James Madison played a key role in formulating the free exercise clauses of the Virginia and federal constitutions. He advocated a division between religion and government based on the demands of religion, rather than solely the interests of society. As you will recall, Madison's final formulation of the Free Exercise Clause spoke of, quote, the free exercise of religion, close quote, rejecting the proposal that protection be given for, quote, the rights of conscience, close quote. In Madison's view, not only was religion different from other forms of conscience, but it was the exercise of religion that merited protection. Yet history offers support for the other side of that compromise as well, when religious exemptions involve harm to third parties. Critical to finding a middle ground is the fact that the free exercise of religion was never understood to create an entirely blank check for religious exemptions. As McConnell has written, early state constitutions did not take such a broad view, instead limiting the right by particular defined state interests. 9 of the states limited the right of free exercise actions to actions that were peaceable or that would not disturb the peace or safety of the state. 4 expressly disallowed acts of licentiousness or immorality. 2 forbade acts that would interfere with the religious practices of others. 1 forbade the civil injury or outward disturbance of others. 1 added acts contrary to good order, and another disallowed acts contrary to the happiness as well as the peace and safety of society. Thus, these state constitutions protected free exercise of religion differently, and often only up to the point where free exercise impermissibly harmed third parties. And let's keep in mind that the First Amendment stated no categorical rules about the relationship between government as government and religion. It was a limitation on what Congress and not the states could do about religion. At times, the current debate risks losing sight of the fact that there has always been a middle ground for accommodating religious liberty: secular government and the rights of third parties. In response to the increasingly divisive rhetoric around these issues, I offer two ideas, neither of which is original to me, based on the premise that we are trying to find a way for a pluralistic society to remain committed to the twin purposes of equality, a principle rooted in the Declaration of Independence and the 5th and 14th Amendments, and tolerances of religious differences, a principle similarly grounded in our nation's history and charter documents. First, and it has been said eloquently throughout today and yesterday, we must undertake our debates in civility. Speaking in the Christian idiom, C.S. Lewis put it best: next to the Blessed Sacrament, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. In a more secular vein, Peter Wehner makes the same point. Wehner writes, civility has to do with the respect we owe others as fellow human beings. It is both an animating spirit and a mode of discourse. Civility establishes limits so we don't treat opponents as enemies. Wehner was in the Reagan White House as well. Maybe he was the young staffer who was upbraided. Civility helps inoculate us against one of the unrelenting temptations in politics and life more generally, which is to demonize and to dehumanize those who hold views different from our own. Civility, properly understood, advances rigorous arguments for a simple reason. It forecloses all ad hominem attacks, which is the refuge of sloppy, undisciplined minds, end of quote. And if the comments of a former member of the Reagan administration and Bush administration aren't persuasive, let's try this from our nation's greatest president, given at the most perilous moment in our nation's history, on the eve of the potential dissolution of the Union, which Lincoln thought would mark the end of this experiment in government of the people, by the people, for the people. President Lincoln famously said at his first inaugural, "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." Now, our bonds of affection are undergoing a stress test. Ominously for us, Lincoln's plea went unheeded. The nation's bonds of affection snapped shortly after he delivered these words, and we live today with the consequences of that failure. Are our bonds of affection strong enough to help us find a way to rely upon the better angels of our nature at this time? I hope so, and I pray so. Which brings me to my second point, this time taken from the work of Martha Minow and Mike McConnell. Both have argued that compromise is possible even where it appears elusive or naive. Minow is the current dean of the Harvard Law School. She is, I am quite certain, a political progressive fully committed to equality. She recognizes that many of the contentious legal issues today are controversial precisely because they pit important rights and values in conflict. In the midst of that tension, she and others have called on both sides to temper their rhetoric and opposition in an effort to seek areas of compromise. The paradox of liberalism, as Dean Minow puts it, is the problem of how to tolerate the intolerant. For those who value religious liberty, gender equality, and greater rights for LGBT persons, there is a practical problem as to how to achieve both those goals when they are in direct conflict. At times, Minow points out, compromise can be seen as a departure from principle, which can mean the abandonment of rights and commitments. But uncompromising can also mean unyielding, and accommodation can be indispensable for stability in a diverse society. Where possible, Minow argues that both sides should seek areas of convergence and compromise where neither seeks total victory, but rather finds ways to accommodate the legitimate concerns of the other. Minow's examples come from the political branches, which have more room to build compromise than the judiciary does when interpreting a statute or the Constitution. Consider a contrast in how San Francisco and Boston handled this type of issue. A while back in San Francisco, there was a deep conflict over the city's policy mandating that certain organizations provide domestic partners benefits equal to those they offer spouses. The Roman Catholic Archdiocese immediately registered opposition and sought an exemption. As Archbishop Levada explained, the ordinance as written created a problem of conscience for agencies of the Catholic Church and perhaps others, because it required that we change our church's internal benefits policies to recognize domestic partnership as equivalent to marriage. This requirement amounted to government coercion of a church to compromise its own beliefs about the sacredness of marriage and seemed to violate the First Amendment, the Archbishop said. He made clear that he would sue if the policy were enforced against church agencies. But he also made clear that the Catholic Church supported health care for everyone. In response, Mayor Willie Brown met with the Archbishop to hash out a compromise, and they succeeded. As a result, the city deemed a contracting party in compliance if it allows each employee to designate a legally domiciled member of the employee's household as being eligible for spousal equivalent benefits. The Archbishop responded to critics who said that they were implicitly giving recognition to domestic partnerships by not excluding them from benefits, explaining that under the plan, the church would know no more or less about the employee's relationship with the member of his household he designates to receive benefits than we typically know about a designated life insurance beneficiary. What we have done, he said, is to prohibit local government from forcing our Catholic agencies to create internal policies that recognize domestic partnerships as a category equivalent to marriage. Minow points to that solution as a way that the city and the church avoided costly and bitter litigation and kept Catholic providers in contractual relations with their city. She emphasized that the key to their success was that the opposing sides treated one another with respect, flexibility, and humility, even when they both believed their cause to involve principles of the highest order. Now, consider what happened in Massachusetts with Boston Catholic Charities. Massachusetts law requires adoption agencies contracting with the state not to discriminate against same-sex couples who seek to adopt children. Boston Catholic Charities specialized in adoption work for hard-to-place children, such as those with disabilities and psychological issues, who often spend years in foster care and move among multiple placements. In 2005, the Boston Globe published a report about how few children the agency placed with same-sex couples. This triggered an avalanche of public attention to the issue, polarizing both sides and leading the agency to request an exemption. When it was denied, the agency withdrew from the state rather than comply with the law. Dean Minow argues that this could have been avoided but for high-profile publicity and adversarial stances that made it impossible for the city and the agency to reach an informal resolution. For example, other dioceses in Massachusetts more removed from public eye have not felt forced to leave the adoption business. Instead, they have referral arrangements with other agencies to whom they can refer same-sex couples to gain adoption assistance. Minow argues that such a cooperation referral arrangement would have produced better outcomes for Boston to keep this long-term vital agency in the business of providing care for especially vulnerable children, while respecting what clearly has emerged as an important theological and internal issue for the Church. She points out that a similar referral practice is already in place for Catholic health care providers to refer patients seeking contraception or abortion to other providers. Moreover, had polarizing rhetoric been avoided, leading the agency to draw a line in the sand, it might have maintained its previous practice of placing some children with same-sex couples when the staff concludes this is a better option for a child who has already lost so many life chances. As Minow sums up the problem, quote, Catholic Charities faced its tragic choice and gave up part of its mission rather than betray firm beliefs. This saved the state from having to consider granting an exemption from the anti-discrimination norm, or more likely, overtly rejecting such an exemption. But both sides now have left very vulnerable children with fewer resources and friends. Dean Minow emphasizes the importance of humility. She argues that the difference between what happened in San Francisco and Boston resulted from differences in attitude more than substance. Attitudes of respect, flexibility, and humility, she argues, can help generate new answers beyond exemption and no exemption when religious principles and civil rights laws collide. She writes, humility does not mean self-doubt or doubt about principle, but it does involve restraint and making room for open and respectful exploration of the other point of view. As she points out, the most likely agents here would be government officials and leaders of religious groups, and not judges, emphasis added, who are typically asked and expected to answer yes or no questions. Importantly, it is not just Minow making this plea. She and Michael McConnell, perhaps polar opposites on the ideological spectrum, one a leading progressive and the other an evangelical Christian and leading scholar on religious liberty, have come together in recent years to make this plea for humility. In a joint op-ed in the Boston Globe last year, they observed that many avidly watch who will win and who will lose in high-stake conflicts over the place of religious views and practices in healthcare, marriage, commercial contracts, and public life. But the biggest losers are the entire nation if we descend into intolerance. As we address the tough issues that lay ahead, they argue, we need a minimum level of civility for our process to work. People who disagree over particular issues should be able to agree that we need more, not less, mutual respect, and more, not less, consideration of accommodations for those on the losing side of the debate. I conclude by asking again, how strong are our bonds of affection? What compromise are we willing to make so that we can create a more perfect union? Some argue that in the face of growing secularization, religious believers should retreat from the public square and form tight-knit communities largely separated from the rest of the world, the so-called Benedict option. Others, and I count myself in this group, are motivated more by the imagery of the salt of the earth, an image that assumes that we are deeply involved in a society larger than our family and congregation. And I would commend to you the address given just this week by Archbishop Chaput at BYU, the Archbishop of Philadelphia, that he gave at BYU, in which he endorses this Augustinian approach. That way forward, being the salt of the earth, is fraught with challenges, and it will involve hard work. But we can do hard things. Years ago, I gave a lecture at BYU titled Politics and the Atonement. It was an effort to persuade my fellow Mormons that disciples don't retreat from politics. Rather, they are called to be engaged in civic life. I started with the story of Enoch, who created a city of people who were of one heart, one mind, dwelt in righteousness, and there was no poor among them. Enoch's city fired the heart, mind, and soul of early Mormonism and set it on a course in which building community became the highest form of spirituality, working to make the effects of the atonement of Christ radiate beyond ourselves and our families. To build a community like Enoch's, that extends beyond family or congregation. It involves politics. Properly understood, I believe, the work of politics is the building of communities that unite people of diverse backgrounds and views in a common enterprise in which both freedom and equality are treasured. When he announced his candidacy for president, Robert F. Kennedy said, "I run for the presidency because I want the United States of America to stand for the reconciliation of men." The word reconciliation conveys the sense of bringing together things that have been separated. Literally, it means to be seated again with someone. In his 1526 translation of the New Testament, William Tyndale employed a recently created English word to capture the concept of reconciliation between God and humankind and between humans themselves, which the King James translators later adopted. The word was at-one-ment, or atonement. Some may think such high-mindedness naive. I disagree. In my view, it is the only way forward that can hope to achieve our twin national purposes of freedom and equality. Thank you very much.